My name is Olivia Reyes, and for 15 years, my family had a very specific way of introducing me at gatherings. This is Olivia, she does something with paperwork for the government, my mother would say, waving a hand vaguely, moving on to the next topic before anyone had time to ask a follow-up question. My sister Claire was blunter about it, usually after a glass of wine or two. "Liv's the responsible one," she'd tell new acquaintances, in a tone that made responsible sound like a consolation prize handed to a woman who hadn't managed to become anything more interesting. Nobody in my family knew that the paperwork I did for the government involved things they would not have believed if I'd told them outright, which is exactly why I never did. This is the story of the night that changed all at once, in the driveway of my sister's very expensive house. I should start by explaining the particular architecture of my family, because I think people sometimes assume favoritism requires cruelty, and in my case it mostly didn't. My parents were not unkind people. They loved both their daughters in their own way. But love in my house growing up was distributed a little like sunlight in a garden with one very large tree. Claire got most of it, not because anyone decided cruelly to withhold light from me, but because she was simply positioned from birth in a way that made her easier to see. Claire is 2 years older than me, and she has always had a gift for being noticed. She was homecoming queen. She was the lead in every school play that had a female lead worth playing. She dated the kind of boys who came to pick her up in cars that made my father whistle appreciatively from the porch, and by the time she was 26, she'd married one of them, Marcus Delacroix, a man from a family with old money and a construction business that had built half the shopping centers in our county. Their wedding cost more than my entire graduate education, a fact my mother mentioned so many times over the following years that I could probably recite the final number from memory even now, a decade later. There's a specific memory from when I was 15 that I still think about, one of those moments that seem small in isolation, but that I've come to understand looking back was actually enormous in what it taught me about my place in that family. I'd made it into a statewide academic competition, one of only a handful of students from our entire school district selected that year. And the event happened to fall on the same weekend as one of Claire's dance recitals. My parents didn't even discuss it as a real decision as far as I could tell, they simply went to Claire's recital, and my father dropped me at the competition on his way, apologizing briefly for not being able to stay, promising to hear all about it later. I placed second in the state that day, genuinely proud of myself in the quiet way you're proud of something nobody witnessed, and when I told my family that evening, my mother said, "That's wonderful, sweetie," already turning to ask Claire again how the recital had gone, whether the new choreography had come together the way she'd hoped. I don't think either of my parents ever registered that moment as a choice they'd made. I registered it very clearly, and I carried it with me for a long time afterward. I was quieter from as far back as I can remember, not because anything traumatic happened to me the way it might in another kind of story, but simply because that seemed to be who I was temperamentally from the start. I liked reading more than performing. I liked solving problems more than being praised for solving them. My parents never seemed quite sure what to do with a daughter whose accomplishments didn't come with an audience built in. And so, over the years, a pattern developed that neither of them probably ever consciously chose. Claire's life got discussed at length, analyzed, celebrated, worried over. My life got summarized, usually in a single sentence, and then the conversation moved on to something more immediately interesting. I studied criminal justice in college, a choice that confused my mother more than almost anything else about me. "But you're so smart, Liv," she said when I told her, in a tone that suggested smartness and criminal justice were somehow at odds with each other in her mind. "Couldn't you do something more, I don't know, impressive with that?" I didn't bother explaining at the time that I had very specific plans for exactly how impressive I intended that degree to eventually become. I'd learned by 20 that explaining my ambitions to my family tended to invite exactly this kind of gentle, well-meaning deflation, and I'd stopped seeing the value in it. I remember that conversation more clearly than almost any other from that period of my life, partly because of what happened immediately afterward. My mother, Apparently satisfied that she'd raised a reasonable concern, pivoted within the same breath to ask whether I'd heard that Claire had gotten engaged to Marcus, sliding a magazine clipping of some celebrity's engagement ring across the kitchen table as a point of reference. I sat there for a moment holding my own half-formed plans in one hand and watching my mother's genuine excitement over my sister's ring in the other, and I remember thinking with a clarity unusual for someone that age, that I was going to have to build whatever I built entirely on my own terms, because nobody in that kitchen was going to help me carry it. I applied to the FBI the year after I finished my master's degree, going through an application and background investigation process that took the better part of 18 months, involving polygraphs and psychological evaluations and interviews, so thorough they seemed to know things about my childhood I'd half forgotten myself. I told my family almost nothing about any of it while it was happening, partly out of the same old instinct to protect my ambitions from premature deflation, and partly because a genuine part of the process involves exactly that kind of discretion you learn early in this line of work, that talking about things before they're finished tends to complicate them. When I finally got the offer, I told my parents over dinner carefully, expecting some version of the reaction I'd gotten to the criminal justice degree. What I got instead was a strange kind of muted congratulations, sandwiched between updates about Claire's upcoming wedding anniversary trip and a home renovation Marcus was overseeing. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," my mother said, and then within the same breath, "Did I tell you Claire and Marcus are thinking about Tuscany this year?" I sat with that for a long moment, the specific familiar sting of watching my own genuinely significant news get absorbed and immediately overtaken by Claire's considerably less significant news, and then I did what I'd always done in that house. I let it go quietly and kept my own counsel about what I'd actually accomplished. Academy training was, in its own way, the first place in my adult life where I felt entirely free of the specific gravitational pull my family exerted on my sense of self-worth. Nobody at Quantico cared whether I was the responsible one, or the quiet one, or any of the other small diminishing labels my family had assigned me over the years. What mattered there was whether I could shoot accurately, whether I could think clearly under pressure, whether I could write a report precisely enough that it would hold up under legal scrutiny years later. I threw myself into all of it with an intensity that surprised even me, driven by something I didn't fully articulate to myself until much later, a quiet burning need to become so genuinely, undeniably competent that no family dinner table conversation could ever again summarize me in a single dismissive sentence. The physical training was harder than I'd expected, even having prepared for months beforehand, and there were entire weeks during that period when I genuinely questioned whether I'd chosen a path built for someone else's body, someone else's endurance. I remember one particular defensive tactics session that left me bruised badly enough that I could barely lift my arm the following morning, and calling my mother that evening out of some old instinctive need for comfort, only to have the conversation drift, within a few minutes, back to a question about whether I thought Claire and Marcus's upcoming engagement party should be black tie or cocktail attire. I didn't mention the bruises. I'd already learned by then that mentioning difficulty in my own life tended to be received as a minor detail rather than something worth dwelling on, and some part of me had simply stopped expecting otherwise. The academic side of training suited me better in some ways than I expected: the case studies, the legal frameworks, the specific discipline required to build an argument, so carefully constructed that it could survive being torn apart by a defense attorney years later. I found somewhere in those months that I had a genuine aptitude for exactly this kind of patient, layered thinking, the kind that doesn't produce a dramatic moment of triumph, but instead produces something quieter and, I came to believe, considerably more durable: a case built so solidly that nobody could ever successfully argue it hadn't been built at all. I won't detail every step of the career that followed, both because much of it isn't mine to share in specifics and because I think the broad shape matters more than any individual case. I worked my way over the following decade into financial crimes investigation, a specialty that surprised people who assumed federal law enforcement was mostly car chases and raid doors. The truth is that a great deal of genuinely significant, genuinely dangerous corruption in this country moves through spreadsheets and shell companies long before it ever moves through anything more dramatic, and untangling that kind of fraud requires a very particular combination of patience, precision, and the ability to hold enormous amounts of complex information in your head at once without losing the thread. It turned out, to my own quiet satisfaction, that these were exactly the skills I'd spent a childhood developing without anyone in my family noticing I was developing them at all. The patience of a person who has learned to wait for years without acting. The precision of a person who has learned that small details matter enormously even when nobody else is paying attention to them. I made special agent relatively young for my specialty, and within a few years I was leading investigations rather than simply contributing to them, running teams of agents and analysts through cases that sometimes took years to fully develop, cases involving amounts of money and layers of deception that would have genuinely shocked my family if I'd ever described them in detail. I never did. I kept almost everything about my actual work private from them, the same careful, deliberate omission I'd practiced my whole life, telling them only that I did something with paperwork for the government, a phrase my mother adopted so completely that it became essentially the family's entire understanding of my professional existence. One case in particular, a few years before the events of this story, taught me more about my own capabilities than almost anything before it. We'd spent nearly 2 years building a case against a network of shell companies laundering money through a series of legitimate-looking regional businesses, work that required piecing together thousands of individually unremarkable transactions into a pattern that would eventually hold up in federal court. There were entire months when the case felt genuinely stalled, evidence trails going cold, witnesses reluctant to cooperate, and I remember the specific, total focus required to keep the team moving forward anyway, to hold the shape of an argument in my head that nobody else could quite see yet, trusting that the pattern was real even when it wasn't yet provable. We got the convictions eventually, all of them, and I remember sitting in my office after the verdicts came in thinking with a clarity that surprised me about every single time my family had summarized my career in a single dismissive sentence, and understanding finally and completely how little that sentence had ever actually described me. Claire, for her part, never once asked a genuine follow-up question about my career in 15 years. I don't think this was malicious exactly. I think Claire simply existed in a world where her own life generated so much natural conversational gravity that it rarely occurred to her that mine might contain anything worth asking about. She loved being the center of every gathering, the host, the woman whose anniversary parties required a guest list managed on a spreadsheet, and I think somewhere along the way she simply absorbed the family's general sense that I was the sister who existed in the margins of the real story, which was always somehow hers. Marcus, my brother-in-law, was a different kind of challenge entirely, though it took me years to fully understand exactly what kind. He was charming in the easy, practiced way of men who have never once had to work particularly hard for anyone's approval, generous at family gatherings with an expensive bottle of wine or an offer to cover the check, the kind of generosity that always seemed to come with a small, unspoken expectation of gratitude attached. He'd made a comment to me once years earlier at a holiday dinner, half joking in the way people use humor to say things they mean seriously. You know, Liv, if the government thing ever falls through, I could probably find you something at the company. Always room for family, even if it's just answering phones. I remember smiling and saying something non-committal, the way I'd learned to do with most comments from that side of the family, and filing the moment away the way I filed away most things without any particular plan for what I might eventually do with it. What none of them knew, what I had in fact gone to considerable professional lengths to ensure they didn't know, was that Marcus Delacroix's construction company had been under investigation by my field office for the better part of 3 years, part of a larger case involving bid rigging on municipal contracts, kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, and a pattern of falsified inspection reports that had, over the better part of a decade, resulted in several structurally compromised buildings across our county. Buildings that housed people who had no idea the foundations under them had been signed off on by inspectors who'd been quietly compensated to look the other way. I had recused myself from the case the moment I discovered the family connection, A recusal that is standard, required, and something I insisted on with more firmness than my supervisors probably expected, given how significant the case had already become to the office's broader efforts in the region. I did not investigate my own brother-in-law. I want to be completely clear about that because it matters to the integrity of everything that follows. I stepped back entirely, disclosed the conflict formally, and let another team, a team I trusted, led by a colleague named Agent Priya Desai who had been building the case for over 2 years, carry it forward without my involvement, without my input, and, as much as I could manage, without my awareness of its progress at all. I remember the specific conversation with my supervisor when I first disclosed the connection, a short, formal meeting that nonetheless felt like one of the more difficult conversations of my career. He'd asked gently whether I was certain I wanted to recuse myself entirely rather than simply being walled off from the most sensitive aspects of the case, and I remember telling him without much hesitation that I didn't trust myself to draw that line cleanly enough, not because I doubted my own integrity exactly, but because I understood, better than most people, how easily good intentions can blur under pressure when family is involved. I'd seen it happen to other agents over the years, well-meaning people who believed they could compartmentalize a family connection and discovered too late that the compartments weren't as sealed as they'd assumed. I wasn't going to be the agent whose case got thrown out on appeal because opposing counsel found a plausible argument about conflict of interest. The case mattered too much for that, and so did the integrity of the work I'd spent 15 years building. I learned the case had finally reached its conclusion the same way I learned most operational details about matters I wasn't directly involved in, through a brief, carefully worded notification that arrived on a Thursday afternoon, informing me, as a professional courtesy given my prior recusal, that an arrest warrant had been approved and would be executed within the following week. I remember sitting at my desk for a long moment after reading it, processing not the legal details, which I already understood in outline, but the specific strange fact of the calendar. The warrant's execution window happened to fall directly across the weekend of Claire and Marcus's 10th wedding anniversary party, an event I had already reluctantly agreed to attend. I spent a fair amount of that Thursday afternoon turning the situation over in my mind, trying to decide what, if anything, I owed anyone in the way of advance warning. I ultimately decided the answer was nothing, not because I wanted to see Marcus humiliated, though I won't pretend some small part of me didn't feel a complicated satisfaction at the coincidence, but because any attempt on my part to influence the timing, even indirectly, even just by asking a colleague to delay or expedite an operation around a family event, would have compromised the exact integrity I'd spent 3 years protecting through my recusal. I made a conscious decision to simply let the case proceed on its own institutional timeline, regardless of what that meant for a Saturday evening party, and to show up to that party the same way I would have shown up to any other family gathering, without any special preparation for what might or might not happen. I want to be honest that I considered briefly asking to be notified of the exact timing, so I could simply avoid the party altogether, sparing myself and my family whatever collision might result from bad timing. But operational security doesn't generally work that way, particularly not for someone who had formally recused herself from a case specifically to avoid any appearance of using inside knowledge to benefit or protect her own family. I genuinely did not know, walking into that party on Saturday evening, whether the warrant would be executed that weekend at all, whether the timing would land during the party, before it, or well after it. I want that uncertainty on the record because I think it matters to what happened next. I wasn't orchestrating a dramatic reveal. I was simply living my life, the same careful, compartmentalized life I'd always lived, while a case I had nothing to do with moved forward on its own institutional timeline. The party itself was exactly the kind of event Claire had always specialized in: string lights across the backyard of the house Marcus's family money had built, a catering staff in matching black aprons, a string quartet playing softly near the pool while 40 guests in cocktail attire mingled with the particular practiced ease of people who attend a great many parties exactly like this one. I arrived a little after 7 in a simple dark green dress, and found myself, within the first 20 minutes, in a conversation with my mother and Claire near the bar that would end up defining the entire evening. I remember thinking, walking up the long driveway toward the house, how strange it was that I still felt a small flutter of the old childhood nervousness before these gatherings, even now, even having spent the day interviewing a witness in a case significant enough to make regional news the following week. Some part of me, I think, never fully stopped being the 15-year-old who came home from a statewide competition to a mother already moving on to the next topic. I'd learned to manage that flutter over the years, to walk into rooms like this one with a kind of professional composure that had nothing to do with actually feeling comfortable, and everything to do with simply refusing to let anyone in that family see the discomfort if I could help it. "You look tired, Liv," my mother said, in the specific tone she used that always managed to sound like concern while landing like criticism. "Are you working too hard again?" "I keep telling her," she added, turning to Claire. "She works entirely too hard for a government paperwork job. There's no reason to run yourself ragged over something like that." Claire laughed, not unkindly exactly, but with the specific carelessness of a woman who has never once had to think seriously about what her sister's job actually involves. "Liv's been doing the same paperwork thing for 15 years now? I keep telling her she should ask Marcus about a real position at the company. Something with actual growth potential." She said this while gesturing vaguely toward Marcus, who was making his way over to us with a fresh glass of champagne, having clearly caught the tail end of the comment. "Absolutely," Marcus said, sliding an arm around Claire's waist, smiling at me with the particular warmth of a man who genuinely believes he is being generous. "The offer's always open, Liv. No shame in it. Not everyone's built for the corporate world, but there's plenty of stable, honest work at the company, for someone who wants it. Steady paycheck. Better than whatever the government's paying you to shuffle papers around, I'd bet." A few nearby guests, half listening, chuckled along with him, the way people do at a party when someone confident makes a joke at someone quieter's expense, uncertain whether laughing is unkind or simply polite. I felt the old familiar sting, the one I'd been feeling at family gatherings for the better part of 3 decades, the specific ache of being reduced, once again, to a punchline in someone else's more interesting story. But it was a smaller sting than it would have been a decade earlier, distant in the particular way old wounds become distant once you've built an entire life that no longer depends on the people who caused them. I smiled, said something non-committal about how I liked my job just fine, and reached for my own glass, and I genuinely believe looking back that the conversation would have ended there, unremarkable, one more small humiliation absorbed and filed away, if the timing of the warrant's execution hadn't happened to land exactly where it did. I heard the vehicles before anyone else at the party seemed to notice them, a specific low sound of multiple engines approaching together, doors opening and closing with the particular synchronized efficiency of a team that has rehearsed this exact choreography many times before. A few guests near the front of the house turned toward the sound first, conversation trailing off in ripples as more and more people noticed the string of black SUVs pulling into the long driveway, headlights cutting across the manicured lawn, doors opening before the vehicles had even fully stopped. The string quartet, still playing near the pool, faltered and stopped somewhere around the second measure of whatever they'd been performing, the musicians exchanging uncertain glances as the low murmur of confused conversation spread backward through the crowd like a wave. I remember the specific strange sensation of standing perfectly still in the middle of that spreading confusion, my champagne glass cool against my palm, watching a scene I had absolutely no advanced knowledge would unfold that exact evening begin to assemble itself in front of me with a kind of surreal, dreamlike clarity. Marcus's face was the first thing I watched change, a slow drain of color that started somewhere around his jaw and spread upward, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his mouth. Claire turned to look at what everyone else was looking at, confusion evident in every line of her body, clearly certain, for a moment, that this had to be some kind of surprise entertainment gone wrong, a mix-up with the wrong address. I heard her say faintly to no one in particular, "Is this a joke? Marcus, did you plan something?" and watched him shake his head slowly, not taking his eyes off the driveway, some deeper understanding already beginning to settle over his features that had nothing to do with confusion at all. I recognized the agents moving up the driveway before they'd even reached the front steps. I'd trained several of them myself, worked cases alongside half the team over the years, and at the front of the group, moving with the calm, deliberate pace of someone executing a plan she'd spent months preparing, was Agent Priya Desai, who caught sight of me standing near the bar and offered the smallest, most professional nod of acknowledgement before addressing the stunned crowd more broadly. "Marcus Delacroix," she said, her voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent backyard. Badge already visible clipped at her waist. "FBI. We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges related to bid rigging, wire fraud, and falsification of federal inspection records." She continued through the formal language of the warrant, the specifics I already understood from years of hearing this exact kind of announcement delivered in exactly this kind of controlled, unhurried voice, and I watched from a few feet away as my brother-in-law's entire understanding of his own evening, his own decade, began to visibly collapse in real time. Claire's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the stone patio, the sound unnaturally loud in a yard that had gone almost completely silent. 40 guests frozen in various states of disbelief, several phones already coming up to record what was unfolding. My mother grabbed my arm hard, whispering, "Olivia, do something, say something, this can't be real." And I remember the specific strangeness of that moment, my mother's hand tight around my wrist, genuinely believing even then that I was simply a bystander who might be able to intervene on the family's behalf. Still, even with agents moving through her own driveway, unable to fully connect the woman she'd spent 15 years describing as doing something with paperwork to the scene playing out in front of her. I gently removed my mother's hand from my arm and stepped forward, toward Agent Desai, and I watched the specific moment the entire party's understanding of me shifted permanently all at once. Agent Desai turned to me with the easy, familiar professionalism of a colleague, not a stranger. "Agent Reyes," she said. "Good timing. We're wrapping the scene now, figured you'd want a heads up given the circumstances, even with the recusal." The silence that followed that single sentence was, I think, the most complete silence I have ever experienced at a family gathering, and I have experienced a great many uncomfortable silences at family gatherings over the years. Marcus, already being read his rights a few feet away, turned his head sharply toward me, disbelief and something close to betrayal moving across his face in quick succession, though betrayal, I remember thinking distantly, was an interesting emotion for a man in his position to be reaching for. Claire stared at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on my sister's face before in 32 years of knowing her. Not anger exactly, and not quite grief, but something closer to a complete, disorienting recalibration. The visible experience of a woman realizing that the sister she'd spent a decade summarizing in a single dismissive sentence had, this entire time, held an entire life several sizes larger than anything she'd ever bothered to imagine for her. "You're," my mother started, still holding the space where my arm had been. "Olivia, you're FBI? You're an agent? This whole time?" 15 years, I said, and I kept my voice even unhurried. The same voice I used to brief youths, attorneys and calm, frightened witnesses in circumstances considerably more difficult than a backyard anniversary party. I recused myself from this specific case the moment I learned Marcus's company was under investigation, because that's what integrity requires, even when it costs you something personally. I didn't do this. I didn't ask for this timing. But I'm not going to apologize for who I am just because it happened to become inconvenient for this party. I looked at Marcus last, still standing with his hands now cuffed in front of him, champagne long forgotten, the offer of a real position from 20 minutes earlier hanging in the air between us with a bitterness that needed no further comment from me. "You mentioned earlier there's no shame in stable, honest work," I said quietly just for him. I happen to agree with you completely. He didn't say anything back. There wasn't really anything left for him to say. The agents finished processing the scene over the following 20 minutes, guests dispersing in stunned, whispering clusters, several of them approaching me with a strange new deference that I found, honestly, a little uncomfortable. The same people who had chuckled politely at Marcus's joke 20 minutes earlier now looking at me like they were seeing an entirely different person, when in fact I hadn't changed at all. I had simply finally been seen accurately, for the first time in longer than I could remember, by people who had spent years choosing not to look closely enough to notice. One of Claire's friends, a woman I'd met a handful of times over the years without ever exchanging more than a few polite sentences, approached me near the edge of the patio, still holding an untouched glass of wine. "I had no idea," she said quietly, glancing back toward where Claire sat alone. "Claire always talked about you like." She stopped herself, apparently thinking better of finishing the sentence, and I told her gently that it was fine, that I understood exactly how Claire had always talked about me, and that I'd made my peace with it a long time before that evening. My mother found me near the driveway as the last of the vehicles pulled away, Marcus already gone in the back of one of them, Claire sitting alone on the front steps of her enormous, suddenly much quieter house, staring at nothing in particular. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" my mother asked, and I heard, underneath the question, the same particular grief I'd have expected, not anger at me, but a kind of retroactive sorrow at everything she'd failed to ask over 15 years because she'd never once considered there might be more to ask about. "I tried a little at the beginning," I told her honestly. "But it stopped feeling worth it pretty quickly. Claire's life was always the one this family wanted to talk about. I got used to being the sentence at the end of the conversation instead of the conversation itself. I stopped minding mostly. I built a whole life in that sentence anyway." She didn't have a response to that, not really, and I didn't need one. I drove home that night without any particular sense of triumph, more a kind of settled, quiet exhaustion, the specific tiredness that comes after a day when something private and long carried finally becomes visible to people who should have seen it years earlier. I remember sitting in my car outside my own apartment for several minutes before going inside, not quite ready yet to let the evening end, replaying the specific strange arc of it, the champagne joke, the sound of the engines, Agent Desai's easy, familiar greeting, my mother's hand tied around my wrist. It didn't feel like victory exactly. It felt more like exhaling after holding my breath for 15 years, which is its own kind of relief, even when it isn't triumphant. The months that followed were complicated in ways that don't resolve neatly, for the purposes of a satisfying ending, and I want to be honest about that rather than pretend otherwise. Claire's marriage did not survive the legal proceedings that followed, not because of anything I did, but because the case against Marcus was, in the end, exactly as serious as it had appeared that night, and Claire spent the following year navigating a divorce alongside a very public unraveling of the life she'd spent a decade building her identity around. It would be dishonest to say I felt nothing but vindication watching that happen to my sister. I felt genuine sympathy too, complicated and real, because whatever our history, watching someone's entire understanding of their life collapse is not something I could observe with pure satisfaction, however much that same sister had spent years failing to see me clearly. Claire and I talk more now than we used to, in a careful, still rebuilding way. She asked me months later, over a quiet dinner that felt different from any dinner we'd shared in years, what it had actually been like all those years being the sister nobody asked real questions of. I told her honestly and she cried, and I let her because I understood by then that some of what she was grieving wasn't really about Marcus at all. It was about finally understanding 15 years too late, the shape of the sister she'd been sitting across from her entire life without ever quite looking up. There was a moment during that dinner I still think about. Claire asked, hesitantly, whether I'd ever hated her, growing up, for how much space she'd taken up without meaning to. I told her the truth, which is that I had, sometimes in the specific, uncomplicated way children resent things they don't yet have language for, but that the resentment had faded slowly over the years, not because anything had been resolved between us exactly, but because I'd eventually built a life substantial enough that her space stopped being able to crowd mine the way it once had. I don't need you to take up less room, Claire, I told her. I just need it eventually to stop needing this family's room at all. That's what actually changed. Not you. Me. She was quiet for a long time after that, turning the words over, and I could see her trying, genuinely trying, to understand a version of our relationship she'd never had reason to examine that closely before. My mother, for her part, has become noticeably more careful around me since that night, asking real questions now where she used to offer vague, deflecting pleasantries about my cases, in the limited way I can discuss them about my actual life, about things that have nothing to do with Claire at all. I don't think that change happened easily for her, and I don't think it happened completely either. Old patterns run deep, and 30 years of a particular family architecture doesn't rebuild itself in a single season. But I notice the effort now in a way I never used to, and I've decided, for my own sake as much as hers, to let that effort count for something even when it's imperfect. I don't do this work for vindication, and I never did. I want to be as clear about that as I was in explaining why I became a fighter pilot in a story I once heard about a woman not entirely unlike myself. I became an agent because the work mattered to me, because I found somewhere in my 20s a version of competence that had nothing to do with being noticed and everything to do with being precise, patient, and quietly thoroughly good at something difficult. The party was never a plan. It was simply my life moving forward on its own timeline, happening to intersect, for once, with a family that had spent 15 years underestimating exactly who they'd been talking to at their own dinner table. I know exactly who I am now the same way I've known for years, long before any driveway full of black SUVs ever made it visible to anyone else. I built that knowledge quietly, case by case, report by report, in rooms where nobody cared whether I was the responsible one or the interesting one, only whether I was thorough enough to get the details right. That, in the end, was always the only audience that ever really mattered to me.